All right, everyone, this is Nathan Lindorf with The Rational Independent, and today we conclude our discussion of Salon's article, Why the Right is So Terrified of Woke. There are truths it just can't face. Fair warning, we still have a lot to get through, so for once in my life, I'll try and talk fast. Quote, "We now live in exactly the country Jefferson and Adams feared, a nominal democracy in which proportional representation has been gamed to death, where politicians are purchased, or at least legally bribed through donations, from corporations and billionaires, and where we increasingly find ourselves ruled by an unnatural and unworthy aristocracy, many of whom not only lack any discernible virtue, but gleefully represent negative virtues." Okay, we're going to break down this real quick. There are many times that people on the left will advocate against the constitutional mechanisms that limit what they call proportional representation. That's a code word for direct democracy. What they're saying is, for instance, there's the initiative to have whoever wins the popular vote should be president. That's not how the Constitution sets it up, but they want to change that structure from the Constitution and replace it with something that resembles more along the lines of direct democracy. Direct democracies are not stable. They are ruled by the mob. They rip themselves apart very quickly. They're dangerous. The founders knew this and built a system that is stable and is the longest surviving constitution in the world by a long measure. So maybe the proof is in the pudding. Maybe the founders knew what they were talking about. Maybe proportional representation / direct democracy is a bad idea. Now, in regards to the rest of this, they're going after the idea that we are ruled by a unworthy and unnatural aristocracy, politicians who have been purchased. It's interesting that they point out and say that politicians have been purchased by corporations and billionaires, leaving outside of that reference labor unions. Guess who's one of the major contributors to political campaigns? Labor unions, shockingly, and particularly public sector labor unions. In other words, left and right and independent all bribe politicians. There are not politically interested businessmen who donate to both parties because donation equals access to politician. Donation is entry into the game. Donation is protection against regulation that'll harm your business, etc., etc. The cost of doing business in a modern America. And one of the reasons it is the cost of doing business is because government has been empowered to directly control and manipulate the private economy in almost every sector. Guess how you fix that? You don't fix that by suddenly creating a virtuous class of politicians. Sorry, they're populated by humans. It's not going to happen. You fix that by limiting the power of government, by checking the power of government through competing branches, and by checking the power between the private sector and the public sector, between states and federal. The more you centralize power to the federal level of the bureaucracy, the more you pull power into the bureaucracy that is not elected or appointed, that is not responsive to voter recall, the more you get an unnatural and unworthy aristocracy that rules the market. The more you incentivize private market actors to try and, legally bribe politicians in order to keep their businesses afloat, in order to protect themselves from this unnatural aristocracy. They have the symptom, but they completely mess up the cause. Later in the article, for some reason, and he doesn't really explain this, so I don't really know where he's going with this, but I thought I'd throw it out there. The author discusses Trump and Elon Musk, swirls them together in some way, and just kind of smears them both and then moves on. I'm going to read it, but take it for what it is. Thanks to the laziness engendered by Trump's wholly undeserved privilege, he has failed many times as a businessman and mercifully failed to overturn the 2020 election. Nice way to take that point for granted and assume that the 2020 election was totally fair and above board, not fortified at all Look that up. There's an interesting Times article there. And that the unrighteous action would have been to overturn that totally fair and completely transparent and wonderful election where Joe Biden outperformed Barack Obama in heavily black districts. If you believe that, well, you'll probably believe anything. Elon Musk had the right combination of interlocked wealth and birth, and his only genius lies in taking credit for the engineering work of others. We now know much more than we ever wanted to about his utter lack of virtue. I don't actually know what he's referring to, other than maybe he's cranky about Twitter? I don't know. This one kind of baffled me. Sometimes when you read these articles that are designed to be consumed within a certain ecosystem, the author takes for granted points that if you're coming in from outside, you haven't read the other supporting articles that reference those points. This paragraph I particularly enjoyed because progressive politics involves creating groups that compete against each other. They need to blame the evils of the current system on white people. And so they point out and make white people, particularly white men, into the bad guys, into the boogeymen. In other words, the thesis of this article could be stated as, if you are white, wealthy, come from a privileged family, attended an elite university, and are currently in business where you donate to politicians and legally bribe them, blah, 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 then you are supporting the class structure that upholds white privilege, and therefore you're a bad guy. Part of that thesis means that if you attend an Ivy League school, you're a bad guy. Except that the Ivy League has been completely captured by leftist politics, by progressive politics. Do you really think if you go to Harvard or Yale or Columbia and you talk to any faculty member, you're going to find someone who's not a leftist? I think they are essentially 100% captured. Those institutions churn out little minds, young minds, that have been formed into progressive zealots, progressive activists. But somehow they're the bad guys and representative of white power. Anyway, I'm going to read this paragraph. These days, the actual political aristocracy, or at least their well-paid minions in Congress, I wonder if they're complaining, by the way, when it comes to well-paid minions in Congress. I wonder if he's willing to point out that Democratic politicians are equally well-paid in Congress. Is that bad for them, or are they saved by the virtue of their politics, and only the well-paid Congress members that are Republican are bad? I don't know. Are always eager to point at their ideological enemies, calling them the woke cultural elite. But most of us can't see who the truly powerful elites are. Upper caste white men from Ivy League schools, even or especially if they affect a drawl, raise a fist in solidarity with insurrection, comically ride a Harley, or otherwise try to bro up with the working class voters they hold in obvious contempt. First, I have no interest in protecting disingenuous Republican politicians. This is why I'm not a Republican. And if you are a Lindsey Graham and you want to pretend to be all on the right, but really you're buddies with progressives, if you're an establishment Republican politician, if you're a Mitt Romney, I have no patience for you and no support for you, besides the obvious irony of referencing Ivy League bad guys. It also further enforces that in this author's perspective, there are only two camps, Republican and Democrat. And anyone who's outside of those two camps is irrelevant enough as to not even be acknowledged. So here I stand, not in either one of those camps, looking at this going, yeah, I don't like you much, but I don't like them either. Politically homeless, on we go. 2 more paragraphs, and then we're done. In the centuries since the notion of whiteness was created, poor and working class white men and women learned the importance of rejecting the truth about white privilege. Wilkerson quotes Yale scholar Liston Pope in 1942. Interesting. I believe that's an Ivy League person. Is this a bad guy? Or is that just modern Ivy League? Writing, the mill worker with nobody else to look down on regards himself as eminently superior to the Negro. Or as Lyndon Johnson famously remarked to Bill Mayers, if you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, he'll give him someone to look down on, and he'll empty his pockets for you. Now, the audacity of quoting Lyndon Johnson on the topic of race relations is pretty incredible. Lyndon Johnson is also credibly quoted as saying, basically, he said that if the Civil Rights Act was passed as is, he'll have those blanks voting Democrat for generations. Was it civil rights or was it the Great Society? Maybe it was the Great Society. Okay, I got to do some research there. But the point is, Lyndon Johnson explicitly used racialized politics for his own personal political advantage. And you're holding him up as a thought leader in this area? Or is he a bad white guy? Except he's a Democrat who pushed progressive. I'm confused. For those of us who still believe in the individualist dream of America, take the referenced mill worker with nobody else to look down on. America is the promise to that mill worker that through diligence, sacrifice, hard work, faith, and family, that man was free to improve his own fortunes. We don't live in a European caste society where your father was a mill worker, your grandfather was a mill worker, your children will be mill workers. You are in that caste and stuck. America, particularly when politicians refer to classes, often refer to economic classes, except we don't have economic classes. We have tiers of statistical economic performance in which people move in and out of them. There have been years of my life where I have made poverty-level wages. There are years of my life where I have made multiples of the national median average of my income. Am I wealthy or am I poverty class? I'm neither, because I'm not in a class or a caste system. I'm an individual. Some years are good, some years are less good. The promise of America is that I can rise or fall to the level of my own personal excellence, the level of my choices. It goes the same. How many of you look at Hunter Biden, born to privilege, raised in a wealthy, politically connected family? How many of you think his children will be as prosperous as he has been? Once President Biden is out of office, how many of you think Hunter Biden will continue to earn millions of dollars a year? Because he's not in a class system. He does not survive or thrive based on his lineage. Because of that corruption, eventually he will have a fall. And that's unfortunate, but it is what it is. I reject completely the overt call to class and race-based envy politics. It is ridiculous. It is poisonous. It is morally bankrupt. Moving on. So cheerful. I wanted to point this out. This last one out is interesting. This is their conclusion. This is their last word. And I wanted to point this one out because it is the left, the progressive left, that overtly rejects the idea of objective truth, objective standards of beauty, objective standards of mathematic and scientific exactness, that the world is mushy and gray and subjective. Even though they do that when it is convenient to them, they still hearken back to a moral standard. The problem is a universally accepted standard of morality requires objective truth to measure against. Morality, is a word that describes whether or not our behavior conforms to a universally agreed upon standard. So the only way for you to use moralistic language in your reasoning is if you accept the existence of objective truth. You cannot do both of these. With that in mind, here's their concluding paragraph. Did you notice my reluctance to say that I am also part of that upper caste group? I wrote that well before Like Me, and there it is, an example of Berry's mirror wound and Wilkerson's rules of the road for high caste Americans. Even in a person who considers himself a progressive, No one wants to admit privilege, especially if we feel it may have been squandered. But the fight to confront and admit such truths, whether or not that's what woke means, is a fight not just to live up to the best possibilities of America, but to become more fully human. This is one of the challenges of having this conversation, because those on the left seek converts to their way of thinking by casting politics through a moral struggle lens. They are creating a godless religion. They are creating a religion that calls for you to seek virtuous actions, except the virtue is defined by their political purposes, your adherence to their political beliefs and ideologies. That's what they describe as virtue. It's a religion that has no room for redemption. That's why those who fall short of the virtuous standards are not healed. They are not brought back into the fold. Generally, they are rejected and expelled from the body politic because they are heretics. They've gone against the virtuous standard, and therefore must be rejected so that the body might remain whole and pure. They describe this as a struggle to become more fully human, to live up to the best possibilities of America. And yet in doing so, they are taking actions that objectively measured will destroy America. This is a fatal road for other republic to go down. This is a big problem. As one final note, I'll say this. They often find their most zealous converts among those who are the most compassionate, because their political remedies, their political policies are framed as policies to help those less fortunate, to lift up the downtrodden, to support those who are down on their luck, etc. That's how they get you. They use that language that speaks to a deep part of your soul that says, I am a good person. I am a compassionate person. I am wealthy beyond what I need. I would happily give a portion of my wealth to improve the lives of my brother. It relies on the moral goodness of unsuspecting dupes to gain new converts and to push forth its policies. They cast abortion as an example through compassionate lenses. A scared young woman who's been taken advantage of by a brutal abuser, a family member, terrible tragedy. Rape and incest are the two things that come up most often when this policy is discussed, and they say, how can you possibly punish a young woman who is in such a terrible circumstance? Surely we need to reach in and save her from this suffering, undo what has been done. That's the language that it's presented at. The objective reality is, in an effort to ease the suffering of one life, you're ending another life. That's an uncomfortable truth. I don't know any way to look at the reality of that situation and see it any other way. It is the ending of a life. But the advocates for this policy use compassionate language and gloss over the effects on the child. Instead, focus on that poor, desperate young woman who's going to have her education interrupted, who's going to have her work opportunities interrupted, who's going to be castigated in society and looked down upon as a desperate single mother. Look how bad it is when single mothers raise children. Statistically, how harmful it is for the child. Surely it would be better. There are people who make the argument that it is more compassionate to spare a child a life of struggle by being raised by a single mother, and that the compassionate alternative is to end the life of the child. They frame murder as compassionate. But here's the thing. If you don't look at it too deeply, if you're just listening with half an ear because you're worried about your own personal life, you can actually be taken in by that. You don't really think about the consequences of what you're doing. But the purpose of this channel is to encourage people to really think about the consequences of what they're choosing. You have to look all the way down the causal chain in order to understand the true consequences of what you're deciding. We are done with this article. We'll move on next week, maybe try and find something a little more lighthearted. I'm grateful for you sticking with me. Have a wonderful day and good luck out there.